On the third day after my husband Bennett's death, I opened his diary. He said he wanted to be a cat in his next life, so he could be held in my arms, even if just once. I cried until I fainted, and when I opened my eyes again, lying beside me in the heavy darkness was Bennett, looking several years younger. This was our newlywed villa, and the time was our wedding night 5 years ago. There was a deathly silence in the air. In our previous life, we were just like this, one sleeping on the left side of the bed, the other on the right, separated by an insurmountable galaxy in between. He was a business tycoon, and I was a wealthy heiress. Our marriage was a perfect transaction, devoid of any emotion or love. We treated each other with the utmost respect, so polite that even arguing seemed unnecessary. I always thought that, like me, he saw this marriage as a duty. It wasn't until his funeral, when his assistant handed me a locked box, that I discovered his diaries, written over 10 years, starting from his teenage years. Every page of those diaries was filled with my name. He had a crush on me, ever since that day in high school when I unintentionally handed him an umbrella. To be worthy of me, he rose from an obscure branch of the family to the pinnacle of power in the Downs family, and then secured this long-desired marriage alliance with the most favorable conditions. He wrote, "Being able to see her every day is already the greatest blessing the gods have given me. I dare not ask for more." He wrote, "She smiled at me today because I blocked a glass of wine that was thrown at her. I didn't send the wine-stained suit to the dry cleaner. I wanted to keep the scent of that smile a little longer." He wrote, "Her stomach is not good, and she often doesn't eat on time. I asked Lucy to keep warm porridge ready every day, but I only dared to say it was Lucy's own idea. I'm such a coward." He wrote, "If I die, would she shed a single tear for me? Probably not. It doesn't matter, as long as she can live well." I held that diary and replayed the 5 years of our marriage over and over in my mind. Every detail I had overlooked turned into the sharpest blade, slowly tearing my heart apart. That unexpected car accident took him away, and with him, all the meaning I had to live. I never imagined that beneath that cold exterior lay a burning affection deep enough to drown me, and now, the gods have truly given me a chance to start over. I looked at him lying beside me. He was sleeping restlessly, his brows furrowed tightly, as if trapped in a nightmare. In my previous life, I had merely turned my back on him coldly, thus beginning our 5 years of lonely marriage. But this time, I sniffled, holding back the overwhelming urge to cry, and carefully moved closer. Then I took the initiative, clumsily, and wrapped my arms around him from behind. His body suddenly stiffened, his muscles instantly tensing up like a startled hedgehog. I could feel his rigid spine and his suddenly rapid breathing. In the darkness, he asked in a voice filled with extreme restraint and a slight tremble, "Nancy, what are you doing?" I buried my face in his back, greedily soaking in his warm body heat, my tears silently soaking his silk pajamas. "Bennett," I choked out, using every ounce of strength to utter the words that were a lifetime too late. "I'm cold." Bennett's body stiffened like a stone. I suppose in his world, Nancy, was a queen on high, calm, rational, never one to show weakness. The word, cold, was probably something he never expected to hear from my lips in his entire life. In the darkness, I could clearly sense his bewilderment. He remained motionless. Even his breath seemed to halt, as if afraid of disturbing me, this unexpected guest. How much of a scoundrel must I have been in my past life, to make him feel that even approaching me was an offense? The ache in my heart was almost overwhelming. I held him even tighter and repeated softly, with a sob in my voice, "Bennett, I'm really cold." This is not a lie. The half-year after losing him, my world was a frozen wasteland, without a trace of warmth. That bone-deep chill still lingers in my soul to this day. Finally, just as I was almost convinced he would remain stiff until dawn, he moved. He turned around extremely slowly, with an almost rigid stiffness. Then, with a tentative touch, as if handling a priceless treasure, he drew me into his embrace. His embrace was not practiced, even a bit clumsy, as if he didn't know where to place his arms, but it was warm, the very warmth from my memory that could shield me from all storms. I could no longer hold back, burying my face in his chest as a lifetime of suppressed tears came pouring out. "Don't cry." His voice sounded above my head, carrying a hint of barely noticeable panic and heartache. He reached out his hand, as if wanting to pat my back to comfort me, but that hand paused halfway, hesitated, and finally just gently landed on my hair. clumsily stroking it. Is it regret?" After a long silence, he asked in a low voice, with a tone almost self-mocking, "Regret marrying me?" The diary mentioned that throughout our wedding, I didn't have a single smile. He must have thought that I detested him to the extreme. I shook my head desperately, lifted my head from his embrace, and by the faint moonlight outside the window, gazed into his unfathomable eyes. Those eyes were filled with pain, self-abasement, and a deep, intense love that he had suppressed to the very bottom of his heart. "No," I looked at him and said, word by word, with utmost clarity, "I was just a little scared." "What are you afraid of?" "I'm afraid that none of this is real." I reached out and gently touched his sharply defined cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin. "Bennett, you'll stay by my side, won't you?" He didn't answer, only looked at me deeply with those complex eyes. After a long while, he raised his hand and covered mine on his cheek, gently stroking the back of my hand with his thumb. Then, in a tone that was almost a sigh, he gave his reply, "I will always be here." This was the most touching love confession he had ever said to me in 2 lifetimes. That night, I fell asleep in his arms. I slept exceptionally soundly, as if trying to make up for all the sense of security I had lacked in my previous life all at once. The next morning, I woke up to the aroma of food. I opened my eyes, and the spot beside me was already empty. My heart panicked, and I sat up abruptly. Thankfully, it wasn't a dream. I slipped on a shirt and walked downstairs, only to see Bennett wearing a cartoon apron that clashed terribly with my pink nightgown. He was clumsily frying eggs in the open kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling window, casting a golden glow around him. "This scene feels too beautiful to be real." The diary said his greatest wish was to make breakfast for me every morning. In our previous life, he never managed to fulfill that wish even once. I had told him I wasn't used to having others around. So aside from the weekly housekeeper, no one else lived in the villa. For 5 years, we survived on takeout and instant meals. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him hurriedly toss a burnt egg into the trash before taking a deep breath and cracking a second one into the pan. My husband, Bennett, who is decisive and ruthless in the business world, making countless competitors tremble at the mere mention of his name, is now at a complete loss over a simple fried egg. My eyes began to well up with tears again. I walked over and wrapped my arms around his lean waist from behind once more. "Bennett, His body stiffened once again, his voice carrying a hint of tension. "You smell nice." I was telling the truth. He had a faint, pleasant woody scent about him. His ears turned visibly red at a rapid pace. Bennett's ears flushed so deeply they seemed about to drip blood. He froze completely, the hand holding the spatula suspended in midair. Like a statue that had been struck by an acupuncture point. The oil is about to splash," he stammered to remind me, but his eyes didn't dare look at me, instead fixed on the slowly forming, still imperfect fried egg in the pan. I didn't let go, instead pressing my cheek against his warm back, saying stubbornly, "I'm not afraid. With you here, I'm not afraid of anything." This breakfast ultimately ended with 2 disastrously cooked fried eggs and a piece of burnt toast. But it was the most delicious meal I've had in 2 lifetimes. At the table, I watched Bennett, who was eating with unusual seriousness and even a bit of restraint, and suddenly said, "I don't have much to do today. How about I accompany you to the company for a look?" Bennett's hand, holding the chopsticks, paused abruptly. He lifted his head sharply, as if he had just heard some incredible fantasy. "In my previous life, let alone going to his company. I never even wore our wedding ring except on the wedding day. I kept our marriage and my personal life completely separate. The company is quite boring." He seemed to be searching for a reason to refuse. "You wouldn't like it." "How do you know I wouldn't like it?" I tilted my head and looked at him. "I want to learn more about your life." "Is that not allowed?" He fell silent, just staring at me with those deep eyes, as if trying to discern the truth behind my words. Finally, he nodded. The atmosphere on the way to the company was a bit delicate. I sat in the passenger seat, secretly observing him. He drove with great focus, and the lines of his profile were even more handsome than in the magazine. Suddenly, I remembered a passage from the diary. He wrote, "Today I drove her to the airport. She spent the whole time looking out the window without saying a word to me. But I was happy because I had specifically replaced the air purifier in the car with the white tea-scented fragrance she likes. This way, With every breath she takes, she breathes in a part of me. I lowered my head and sniffed the scent on myself. Good, it was still the white tea fragrance he liked. As the car pulled up in front of the Downs Group building, I was about to unbuckle my seatbelt when Bennett suddenly spoke. Wait. I looked at him with confusion. He unfastened his seatbelt and leaned in closer. The distance between us instantly narrowed, and I could even see his thick eyelashes and the barely concealed nervousness in his eyes. My heart skipped a beat, thinking he was about to do something. As a result, he just reached out and unfastened the seatbelt that I had been struggling with for a long time. This buckle is a bit tight. His voice carried a barely noticeable hoarseness, and after speaking, he quickly withdrew, sitting back properly and staring straight ahead, but his reddened ear tips once again gave him away. Looking at him, I suddenly felt that this man was so adorable it made my heart ache. I followed Bennett into that impressive skyscraper. Every employee who saw me had an expression as if they'd seen a ghost. Their eyes were filled with shock and curiosity, as if saying, how could the boss's wife, who's rumored to have a strained relationship with the boss, appear here? Bennett seemed to sense those gazes too. His body tensed up slightly, and he instinctively tried to create some distance between us, but I was one step ahead. I reached out and linked my arm with his arm instantly stiffened, and his footsteps faltered for a moment. I could feel the air in the entire company freeze at that moment. I looked up and gave him a sweet smile. Mr. Downs, why don't you show me around your office? I deliberately made the words, Mr. Downs, sound soft and sweet. His face successfully turned red again. Bennett's office is on the top floor, occupying the best view. The decor style, much like the man himself, is calm, restrained, with almost no personal traces visible. In my previous life, I never came here even once. Now, I'm like a curious baby, touching here and looking there. Bennett stood by, looking at me helplessly, like a host who didn't know how to entertain a guest. Are you thirsty? Would you like something to drink? He finally found something to say. Yes. I walked behind his desk, unceremoniously sat down on the leather chair that symbolized absolute power, spun around once, and then looked at him with a smile. I want coffee brewed by you personally. Bennett was taken aback for a moment, then said somewhat awkwardly, I'll have my secretary. No, I interrupted him, a hint of coquettishness in my tone. I only want the one you brew. I had written in my diary that he secretly learned how to make pour-over coffee just to have more topics to talk about with me, because I once mentioned in an interview that I loved drinking pour-over coffee. He bought a whole bunch of coffee beans and equipment, practiced countless times at home, but never dared to let me know. Watching his slightly flustered back, I knew I had bet right. He took out a complete set of professional pour-over equipment from a hidden cabinet. His movements were practiced, grinding the beans, warming the pot, pouring the water, each step executed meticulously, as if performing a sacred ritual. Soon, the rich aroma of coffee filled the entire office. He placed a freshly brewed cup of coffee in front of me and looked at me somewhat nervously. Want to try it? I took a sip. It was my favorite Yirgacheffe, with just the right balance of acidity and richness. It's delicious, I praised sincerely. He visibly relaxed, the corners of his mouth lifting into a small, unconscious smile, like a child who had just received a compliment. Just then, the office door was knocked. Come in. Bennett's voice returned to its usual coldness and firmness. The person who entered was his cousin, Simon, who was also the vice president of the Downs Group. When Simon saw me sitting in the boss's chair, a flicker of undisguised surprise and envy flashed in his eyes. In my previous life, after Bennett's death, he was the first to step forward and take over the company with swift and decisive measures. The car accident that led to Bennett's death, in hindsight, was full of suspicious points. At the time, I was too immersed in grief to pay attention to anything else. But now, I won't let the tragedy repeat itself. Why is my sister-in-law here? Simon wore a hypocritical smile on his face, but his gaze slithered over me like a venomous snake. I came to see my husband. Is that not allowed? I smiled, but there was a hint of provocation in my tone. Simon's smile stiffened for a moment. Brother, I brought the documents for the project in the Southern District. Take a look. He quickly returned to his usual self, handing a file to Bennett, as if trying to use work to assert his importance and push me, the outsider, aside. South City project. My heart sank. This is the project. In my previous life, Bennett had the car accident on his way to inspect the South City project site. I watched Bennett take the document and start reading it carefully, my heart racing uncontrollably. No. I have to do something. I stood up, walked over to Bennett, wrapped my arms around his neck from behind, rested my chin on his shoulder, and whispered into his ear in a voice only the two of us could hear, "Honey, I'm not feeling well today. Could you leave work early and go home with me?" My breath brushed against his ear, and his body stiffened once again. Even his movement of flipping through the files came to a halt, across from us. Simon's face instantly turned extremely unpleasant. Bennett ultimately agreed to me, with an almost flustered demeanor. He closed the file on the South City project, told Simon, whose face was livid, "Let's put this project on hold for now," and then, under the watchful eyes of all the employees, practically fled in panic as he left the company with me. The atmosphere in the car on the way back was even more silent than on the way there. I could sense the storm raging inside Bennett. My actions today have completely overturned his perception of me over the past 5 years. He must be frantically guessing what I'm really trying to do. "Nancy," he finally couldn't help but speak up, his voice tinged with a hint of difficulty, "is something going on at home? Do you need the Downs family's help?" My heart felt as if pricked by a needle. So, in his eyes, all my closeness to him could only be linked to benefits. That's right, in my previous life, I almost never contacted him on my own initiative, except when I needed the Downs family's resources to support my personal career. How much harm did I cause him to make him lose even the courage to imagine that I might like him? I didn't answer his question, but instead asked softly, "Bennett, do you trust me?" He was taken aback for a moment, as if he hadn't expected me to ask that. "If you trust me." I turned my head and looked into his eyes with utmost seriousness. "Don't touch the project in the Southern District anymore. Hand it over to Simon." "Why?" He frowned. "I've been working on that project for a long time. It's very important." "No reason," I said, unable to explain and resorting to the most unreasonable approach. "Just consider it me being willful. I don't want you going to that place. Is that okay?" The car fell into silence once again. Red light. The car stops. Bennett turned his head and looked at me deeply, his eyes as complex as a thick fog. And I couldn't see what was hidden within. After a long while, he gave in, his voice carrying a hint of helplessness and indulgence. "Okay, just one word." Yet it made my eyes well up instantly. He didn't even question my reasons. Just because I said, "I'm being willful," he gave up on an important project he had been working on for a long time. How deeply does this man really love me? When we got home, perhaps because his actions at the company during the day had drained too much of his energy, Bennett reverted to that cautious, hesitant demeanor, keeping his distance from me. He locked himself in the study and didn't come out until late at night. I lay in bed, pretending to be asleep. He tiptoed in extremely quietly and stood by the bed for a very, very long time. So long that I almost thought he had turned into a statue. Then, I felt the other side of the mattress gently sink down. He lay down, keeping a vast distance between us. In the darkness, I could hear his suppressed, restrained breathing. I suddenly felt very sad. What I want is not this kind of caution. I turned over to face him, accurately found his hand in the darkness, and then, one by one, forcefully squeezed my fingers into the gaps between his, interlocking our fingers tightly. His hand trembled violently, as if struck by an electric shock. "Nancy." "Bennett," I interrupted him, my voice trembling with a hint of command. "Hold me." He didn't move. "Hold me." I intensified my tone, almost pleading. Finally, as if he had made up his mind, he abruptly extended his other arm and pulled me forcefully, fiercely, into his embrace. The force was so great it nearly crushed my bones. His chest was scorching hot, and the sound of his heartbeat pounded like a war drum, striking heavily against my eardrums, one beat after another. "Nancy," he whispered in my ear, his voice dreamlike, filled with endless pain and ecstasy, calling my name over and over again. "Nancy, Nancy." As if he wanted to shout out all the unspoken love from these 2 lifetimes. From that day on, my relationship with Bennett entered a delicate balance. During the day, he was still the composed and self-controlled Mr. Downs, though he would often pause for a long moment during meetings after receiving a text from me saying, "Remember to eat." At night, he would lie beside me, stiffly allowing me to cling to him like an octopus. Only after confirming I was sound asleep would he dare to secretly wrap his arms around me and press an incredibly rare, feather-light kiss on my forehead. I knew it all along, but I didn't dare to call it out. I was afraid of scaring him away. This frightened hedgehog needs more patience and warmth from me to willingly retract its spines. I began to carry out my cheating plan. I knew he liked a very obscure Nordic post-rock band. In his previous life, he had secretly attended the band's only tour performance in China, all by himself. I used all my connections to get a signed CD from every member of that band. One weekend afternoon, I handed it to him as if presenting a treasure. Here, this is for you. He stared at the CD, completely stunned, his eyes filled with disbelief. How did you? I guessed you'd like it, I said casually. Though I was extremely nervous inside, he took the CD, gently rubbing the signature on it with his fingertips, bowing his head and remaining silent for a long time. I couldn't see his expression clearly, but I noticed a drop of scalding liquid fall onto the transparent case of the CD. He cried. My heart felt as if it were being tightly gripped by an invisible hand, the pain so intense I could barely breathe. To spare him the embarrassment, I pretended not to notice and turned toward the kitchen. I made your favorite sweet and sour pork for dinner. Go wash your hands and eat. Sweet and sour pork tenderloin is the dish that appears most frequently in the diary. He said it was the only dish his mother knew how to make when he was a child. After his mother passed away, he never had an authentic version again. I actually don't know how to cook. For this dish, I secretly made a mess in the kitchen, burned countless batches, and even got several blisters on my hands. But when he looked up at me with his reddened eyes and silently finished the entire plate of sweet and sour pork tenderloin, I felt it was all worth it. After finishing the meal, he voluntarily washed the dishes. I leaned against the kitchen door, watching his somewhat unskilled back, and suddenly had an illusion, as if we had already lived like this, peacefully, for many years. That night, for the first time, he didn't wait for me to fall asleep. Just as I lay down, he proactively pulled me into his arms. Although his movements were still a bit stiff, this was already a huge improvement. Nancy, he whispered in my ear. Why? I knew what he was asking. Why was I suddenly being so nice to him? I remained silent for a long time, organizing my thoughts. I couldn't tell him the truth. It was too unbelievable. Maybe. I snuggled deeper into his embrace. Finding a comfortable position, I suddenly realized that my husband is actually quite good. He didn't say anything more, but his arms around me tightened a little. I can feel that the iceberg within him is gradually melting and cracking because of my approach. Everything is moving in a positive direction, except for Simon. After I had Bennett transfer the South City project to him, he appeared extremely grateful on the surface, but behind the scenes, he started showing up around us even more frequently. He would come to our home under the pretext of reporting on work, and then, in a seemingly unintentional tone, bring up some things from my past. Sister-in-law was quite the popular figure back in school, the line of boys chasing after you could stretch from the school gate all the way to the end of the street. I remember sister-in-law was most fond of extreme sports. Brother, with your quiet personality, can you keep up with her? Every word he spoke subtly reminded Bennett that we were from two different worlds. He was pouring bucket after bucket of freezing ice water over Bennett's heart, which had just begun to thaw. Simon's provocation was like invisible venomous thorns, precisely piercing Bennett's most vulnerable nerves. I could feel Bennett's mood visibly sinking into despondence and unease. He began to retreat into silence again, instinctively stepping back half a step when I approached, and the light in his eyes gradually dimmed. He was afraid. He was afraid that all the kindness I showed him now was just a fleeting illusion. He feared that after waking from this dream, I would revert to the icy Nancy who treated him with cold indifference. One Friday evening, he had an important social engagement and didn't return until very late. In our previous life, every time he came back from such gatherings, he would sleep in the guest room, afraid that the smell of alcohol on him would bother me. I waited until late at night before finally hearing a faint sound at the door. I walked out and saw him leaning against the wall in the entryway, seemingly waiting for the alcohol scent on him to dissipate. He drank a lot, his face flushed, but his eyes were unusually clear. When he saw me, he froze for a moment, then instinctively stepped back, trying to put some distance between us. I smell like alcohol. I don't mind. I stepped forward and steadied his slightly unsteady body. His body is burning up, I helped him to the sofa and went to the kitchen to pour him a glass of warm water. He took the glass but didn't drink, just lowered his head and stared at his reflection in the water. Nancy, he suddenly spoke, his voice terribly hoarse. You don't have to do this. My heart sank. You don't have to compromise yourself like this for the Duncan family's business. He lifted his head. His eyes filled with red streaks. Within them was a pain I had never seen before. Deep and unfathomable. Simon told me everything. The Duncan family is currently competing for an overseas project and needs financial support from the Downs family. I was stunned. So this is how Simon explained my recent unusual behavior. This reason is so plausible, so perfect that I can't even refute it. Yes, a wife who hasn't cared about you for 5 years. How could she suddenly change? The only explanation is self-interest, seeing the pain in his eyes. I suddenly realized just how ruthless Simon's move was. He wasn't just trying to sow discord, he was aiming straight for the heart, in the cruelest way possible. He was extinguishing the tiny flicker of hope that had just ignited in Bennett's heart. That's not how it is. My voice trembled slightly, unsure whether I was angry or heartbroken. It's fine. Bennett forced a smile that looked even more painful than tears. We agreed on this when we got married, a business alliance. Each getting what we need. If you need something, just tell me directly. There's no need to be so kind to me. The phrase, be so kind to me, when spoken by him, carried a tone of something pitiful, as if he were receiving charity. I could no longer hold back my tears. What on earth have I done to him? I threw down the water glass, lunged forward, straddled his legs, cupped his face in my hands, and kissed him fiercely. This kiss carried my anger, my heartache, my regret, and an overwhelming, no longer suppressible love. I recklessly used all my passion to pry open his tightly sealed lips, to dispel all the unease and self-doubt within his heart. Bennett froze completely. The water glass in his hand fell to the ground with a loud crash, shattering into pieces. The warm water splashed onto my pants, but I didn't notice it at all. In my world, there was only him. It wasn't until I was almost out of breath that I gently pulled away from him. Resting my forehead against his, gazing into his wide, shocked eyes, and word by word, I spoke the words he had waited 2 lifetimes to hear. Bennett, I love you. The entire world seemed to fall silent after I said, I love you. Bennett stood as still as a statue struck by lightning, unmoving, with only his heaving chest and trembling eyelashes betraying the storm raging inside him. His eyes were filled with shock, confusion, ecstasy, and a disbelief so profound it broke my heart. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but his Adam's apple bobbed several times without a single syllable escaping. Watching him in this stunned state, I felt both heartache and amusement. I lowered my head, gently rubbing the tip of my nose against his, and softened my voice with a hint of grievance. Did you hear me? I said I love you, not because of the Duncan family. Not because of interests, but simply because I love you. He finally reacted. He reached out his hand and, with a force that was almost trembling, touched my cheek. Then, with his rough fingertips, he wiped away the tears on my face, bit by bit, as if handling something precious. Liar. He looked at me and squeezed out those 2 words from his throat. His voice was hoarse, like a traveler who had trekked through the desert for months. He called me a liar, yet in his eyes, glistening tears were rapidly gathering. I didn't lie to you. I took his hand, which was lingering on my face, and gently kissed his palm. In the past, it was my fault. I was blind. I was a fool. I didn't see how good you were. Can you give me another chance? He didn't answer. Instead, he gripped my hand tightly, then suddenly lifted me from his lap, holding me close, tightly, as if cradling a child, and wrapped me in his arms. I could hear his suppressed, wounded animal-like sobs. He cried. This man, who seemed invincible to the outside world, was now crying in my arms like a child who had finally found his way home. He didn't say a word, but I knew that the volcano in his heart, frozen for 10 years, had finally erupted completely at this moment. He gave me his answer through his actions. He believed it. From that day on, Bennett seemed like a different person, or rather, he finally dared to reveal his true self. Bit by bit, in front of me, he was no longer cautious, no longer holding back. He would bossily wake me up in the morning, just to have me accompany him for a breakfast he made himself, which was still not very successful. he would corner me against the wall and punish me with one deep kiss after another for forgetting to reply to his messages because of work. He would act like a clingy big dog, insisting on resting his head on my lap while I was reading. He would also clumsily brew brown sugar water for me when I had period cramps. Then hold me in his arms and use his warm, large hands to soothe my stomach all night long. He transformed all the unspoken love from that diary into actions, clumsily yet passionately enveloping my entire being. Our home finally started to feel like a home. It was filled with the warmth of everyday life and love that could be felt everywhere. However, the sweet days didn't last long. One day, something major happened at Bennett's company. An assistant he trusted the most, who had been with him for many years, was found to have stolen the company's core secrets, sold them to a competitor, and then absconded with the money. The company suffered enormous losses as a result. Bennett locked himself in his study and didn't come out all day. When I brought in the meal, I saw him standing alone by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette desolate and lonely. I walked over and hugged him from behind. "Don't be sad," I comforted him softly. "Money can be earned again. It's not about the money." He turned around and looked at me, his eyes filled with a weariness and disappointment I had never seen before. "That person has been my friend since college. I always considered him as close as a brother, a brother." My heart suddenly turned cold. I suddenly remembered something I had overlooked. In my previous life, the driver who took Bennett to the construction site in the southern part of the city was this assistant. The official conclusion for that car accident was brake failure, and that assistant also died on the spot in the car accident. A perfect accident, with no evidence left. As I looked at the unguarded pain on Bennett's face caused by the betrayal, a terrifying thought began to wildly grow in my mind. This betrayal was only the beginning. It is a signal, a countdown urging Bennett towards the final outcome of death. The assistant's betrayal was like a massive rock thrown into our recently calmed lives. Although Bennett put on a brave face in front of me, I knew this incident had hit him hard. He became even more silent, often lost in thought by himself. As for me, I fell into an even deeper fear. I began to act like a neurotic detective, frantically recalling every detail surrounding Bennett's car accident in my previous life, trying to find some clues. But I discovered that it was a perfectly orchestrated accident. There was no evidence, no flaws. The only breakthrough might be Simon. I began to investigate him discreetly, using the connections I had built up in my previous life. I looked into his financial transactions and the people he had been in contact with privately. The results sent chills down my spine. I discovered that Simon had been involved in large financial transactions with the assistant who had betrayed Bennett. Moreover, Simon has been frantically and recklessly buying up scattered shares of the Downs Group on the secondary market, all in secret. His ambition is now crystal clear. He intends to use his shares to take control of the entire Downs Group as quickly as possible after Bennett's death. I laid all this evidence before Bennett. He stared at the bank statements and transaction records, remaining silent for a long, long time. When he looked up again, the exhaustion and disappointment in his eyes had vanished, replaced by the calm and sharpness that Mr. Downs, decisive in the business world, should possess. "I understand," he said only these 4 words. There was no anger, no questioning, as if he had long anticipated all of this. "Did you suspect him all along?" I couldn't help but ask. He nodded, took my hand, placed it in his palm, and gently kneaded it. "The Downs family is a place that devours people. I managed to rise from a powerless branch to where I am today not by being naive." He looked at me, a trace of bitterness in his eyes. "I just didn't expect him to be in such a hurry." He paused for a moment and continued, "My assistant betrayed me. The core secrets he took were actually fake materials I deliberately leaked. I originally intended to use this to lure the snake out of its hole and expose the person behind him. I never expected that person to be his own cousin. And I never expected that I would help him find the most direct evidence, Nancy." He suddenly called my name in an extremely serious tone. "Thank you, we are husband and wife." I looked at him. "I won't let anyone hurt you." He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he had shown in a long time. He pulled me into his arms, resting his chin on the top of my head, and whispered, "In the past, I always fought alone. Now, it seems I have a weakness." My heart ached with tenderness. "No." I lifted my head and looked at him. "I am not your weakness, I am your armor." In the days that followed, Bennett and I began a quiet counterattack. He took advantage of Simon's greed, deliberately releasing several seemingly lucrative but actually deceptive fake projects, gradually tying up Simon's funds. As for me, I used my identity as the eldest daughter of the Duncan family to navigate various high society gatherings, subtly spreading rumors about Simon's chaotic private life and embezzlement of public funds. We were like a pair of well-coordinated hunters, gradually tightening the net. Simon soon sensed that something was wrong. He became restless and suspicious, like a trapped beast. I knew that when a person is pushed to the brink, they are capable of anything. He is not far from his final, desperate, mutually destructive plan, and I must, before he acts, devise a foolproof strategy to completely cut off all his possibilities. The day of the decisive battle came faster than I had anticipated. That day was the anniversary celebration of the Downs Group. In the previous life, it was after this celebration that Bennett received the phone call about the incident at the construction site in the southern part of the city. He rushed overnight and ultimately lost his life on the way. In this life, although the Southern City project has been handed over to Simon, there is no guarantee that he won't use some other excuse to lure Bennett out. Throughout the entire celebration, my nerves were stretched taut, like a string on the verge of snapping at any moment. I stayed close to Bennett's side, vigilantly observing everyone around us. Bennett seemed to sense my nervousness. Without a word, he took my hand, the warmth of his palm conveying a sense of calm and strength. "Don't be afraid, I'm here," he whispered. Halfway through the banquet, Simon approached with a glass in hand, a wide smile on his face. He looked no different than usual, but his eyes were like poison daggers, fixed intently on Bennett. "Brother, sister-in-law, I'd like to propose a toast to you." Bennett was about to raise his glass, but I stopped him by pressing my hand on his. I looked at Simon with an innocent smile and said, "Cousin, what a shame. But Bennett is allergic to alcohol and can't drink. I'll drink this glass on his behalf." Without waiting for his response, I picked up Bennett's glass and downed it in one go. Simon's face instantly turned extremely unpleasant. The surrounding guests also cast strange glances one after another. Everyone knows that Bennett has a high alcohol tolerance. Using an alcohol allergy as an excuse is practically insulting to one's intelligence. I just want to use this method to tell Simon, as long as I'm here, don't even think about laying a finger on Bennett. He held on for a few seconds, then finally forced out an awkward smile. "Is that so? What a pity." After saying that, he turned and left. I watched his retreating figure, and the ominous feeling in my heart grew stronger and stronger. He was too calm. This isn't the reaction one would expect from someone whose conspiracy has been exposed. Sure enough, as the banquet was nearing its end, a waiter hurried over to Bennett and whispered something to him. Bennett's face instantly changed. "What's wrong?" I immediately asked. "The warehouse is on fire." Bennett's voice was extremely grave. "Inside, there's a batch of very important new products." The warehouse again. In his previous life, he had received a call about an accident at the construction site. This time, it's "the warehouse is on fire." Simon used the same old trick again. Just a change in appearance but not in substance. "I must go there immediately," Bennett said, about to stand up. "I'll go with you." I grabbed his hand tightly. "No," he refused firmly. "It's too dangerous." "Bennett," I was so anxious I was about to cry. "Listen to me. It's a trap. You can't go, Nancy. I know you're worried about me." He held my face, his eyes filled with apology and determination. "But that shipment is crucial to the company's future. I have to go. Wait for me at home, and I promise I'll come back as soon as I'm done." Looking into his unwavering eyes, I knew I couldn't persuade him. This man had responsibilities he had to bear. What should I do? What should I really do? My mind is racing. Call the police. It's too late. Ask for help. Distant water cannot quench a nearby fire. I watched him turn around and resolutely walk away, my heart feeling as if it were being squeezed by an invisible hand, hurting so much I could barely breathe. In my previous life, I watched helplessly as he walked toward his death. In this life, must I go through it again? No, absolutely not. A crazy idea began to take shape in my mind. I quickly chased after him and grabbed him just as he was about to get into the car. "Bennett," I looked at him and said in a tone that was almost desperate, "do you remember our wedding night?" He froze, not understanding why I suddenly brought this up. "That night, I told you I was cold. I looked into his eyes and, word by word, revealed the secret that was enough to shatter his entire worldview. That's because I just came back from your funeral, Bennett. I've died once before. I've been reborn from 5 years in the future. 11. The expression on Bennett's face froze. He stood there like a petrified statue, staring at me in a daze, his pupils filled with immense, incomprehensible shock. The air around us seemed to stop flowing after I spoke those words. Nancy, you, he struggled to speak, his voice hoarse and barely recognizable. Do you know what you're saying? I know, I said, gripping his arm tightly, my nails almost digging into his flesh. I know it sounds absurd, but every word I said is true. Frantically and incoherently, I poured out everything I knew. You will die tonight in a car accident disguised as an accident. Brake failure, a truck rear-ends you, the car is destroyed and you die. The murderer is Simon. He wants your company. He wants everything you have. The warehouse fire is fake. It's just an excuse he used to lure you out. The brakes on the car you're driving now must have been tampered with. My voice, filled with agitation and fear, became sharp and trembling. Bennett didn't speak, just stared at me intently with those unfathomable eyes. In his eyes, there was no doubt, no fear, only a kind of deep, suffocating heartache. He raised his hand, gently, so gently, and touched my tear-streaked face. So, his voice carried an incredible, suppressed tremor. You were good to me before. Because you already knew everything. My heart was sharply pained by his words. So, even at this moment, he was still fixated on that question. This fool. Yes, I cried, nodding vigorously. It's because I know how much you love me. It's because I regret it. I regret that in my past life, I was like a blind person, turning a blind eye to all your kindness. Bennett, I don't want to lose you again. I don't want you to die. He smiled. Tears, however, streamed down from the corners of his eyes. It was a smile mixed with ecstasy, sorrow, and boundless love. Fool, he pulled me tightly into his arms, holding me close. So that's how it is. So that's how it is. He seemed to be speaking to me, yet also to himself. I was still wondering, what have I done to deserve your love for me? So, it was the deity who sent you back to punish me. He said I was sent by the deity to punish him. How could there be such a foolish person in this world? Just then, his phone rang. It's the assistant calling. Bennett let go of me, answered the phone, and put it on speaker. From the other end of the line came the assistant's anxious voice. Mr. Downs, you must not go to the warehouse. I just found out that the fire alarm there was a false alarm. It's Vice President Simon. Everything matched exactly what I had said. Bennett hung up the phone and looked at me, with not a trace of doubt left in his eyes. He grabbed me and quickly got into another backup car. To the hospital, he said to the driver. What are we going to the hospital for? I asked, puzzled. Simon probably can't wait any longer. He looked at the night scenery rapidly receding outside the window, his gaze turning cold and sharp. His only reliance is those illegally acquired shares in his possession. And there is only one thing that can prove the ownership of those shares. What is it? My father's will. Bennett's voice carried no trace of emotion. That will has always been stored in a safe deposit box at a Swiss bank. There are 2 keys to open that box. One is with me, and the other, he paused and mentioned a place I never expected, was hidden inside my bone by my father through a special surgical procedure. I was so shocked by Bennett's words that I couldn't utter a single word for a long time. Hiding the key inside a bone, this is the kind of plot you'd only see in a movie. So, Simon's goal from the very beginning wasn't to have you die in a car accident. I suddenly understood everything. He wanted your body, to be precise. Bennett's face looked somewhat pale under the flickering lights outside the car window. It's the key inside my body that they want. A chill ran up from the soles of my feet. Simon's madness and obsession far exceeded my imagination. Then let's go to the hospital now. My father left behind more than just a key. Bennett looked at me, a complex emotion flickering in his eyes. He also left behind a person, the best surgeon in the world, and the only one who knows how to retrieve that key. The car soon came to a stop in front of a private hospital. An elderly man in a white coat, with graying hair, was already waiting at the entrance. Upon seeing us, he immediately stepped forward to greet us. You've finally come after all. The old man looked at Bennett and sighed. Uncle Leo. Bennett nodded to him. Dr. Leo led us through a long corridor and into a state-of-the-art operating room. Are you really sure about this, Dr. Leo looked at Bennett. This surgery carries significant risks. The location of that key is extremely close to your central nervous system. I had no choice. Bennett's tone was calm and resolute. He turned his head, looked at me, and suddenly smiled. Nancy, do you remember what I wrote in my diary? I said, in my next life, I want to be a cat, held in your arms. I nodded, and tears began to fall uncontrollably once again. Now, I don't want to anymore. He reached out his hand, wiping away my tears, his eyes filled with unprecedented tenderness and love. I want to be a person who can hold you openly, protect you, and stay with you for a lifetime. So, he took my hand, brought it to his lips, and gently kissed it. Wait for me outside, I'll be out soon. I watched as he was wheeled into the operating room, that cold door slowly closing in front of me, the red light indicating, surgery in progress, lit up. At that moment, I felt as if all the strength in my body had been drained away. I leaned against the cold wall and slowly slid down to the floor. Time had never felt so agonizing. I don't know how long it has been, maybe a century, maybe just an hour. My phone suddenly rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I answered it, and from the other end came Simon's voice, distorted with anger. Nancy, where is Bennett? Where have you hidden him? The plan for the warehouse has failed, and he probably already knows that the matter has been exposed. Simon, my voice was unexpectedly calm. You've lost, I've lost. Ha ha ha, he burst into wild laughter. As if he had heard the biggest joke of all time. Nancy, you're so naive. Do you think just because you've hidden him, I can't do anything? Do you believe me when I say I can make you never see him again, right now? What do you mean? My heart tightened suddenly. It's nothing much. His voice turned cold and venomous. I just sent someone to your parents' house to greet them. If you don't want anything to happen to them, come alone to the abandoned factory in the west of the city, remember. Come alone. The call was disconnected. I held the phone, my blood freezing in an instant. Simon, that lunatic, he actually threatened me using my parents. I stared at the still-lit, glaring red, surgery in progress, light, facing the most agonizing decision of my life. In the end, I went. I couldn't gamble with my parents' lives. The abandoned factory in the western part of the city was dark, damp, and filled with the smell of rust and decay. Following Simon's instructions, I walked alone into the building, which resembled the gaping mouth of a monster. In the center of the factory stood Simon, with several menacing men behind him. My parents were not there. Where are my parents? I looked at him coldly, my voice devoid of any warmth. Don't rush, sister-in-law. Simon smiled triumphantly, his once handsome face now twisted with jealousy and madness. As long as you cooperate obediently, I promise they will be safe and sound. What do you want? Simple. He walked up to me, eyeing me up and down with an almost greedy gaze. I want you to tell Bennett, in your own words, that you never loved him, that you were only good to him to use him, for the benefit of the Duncan family. Then, divorce him and marry me. I'm so angry at his words that I could laugh. Simon, have you lost your mind? I have lost my mind. He suddenly grabbed my shoulders, shaking me violently, his eyes blazing red. I have lost my mind. Why does Bennett have everything? He gets to run the company, he gets grandfather's favor, and he even gets to marry you. And what about me? What am I lacking compared to him? I've liked you since we were kids. Do you even know that? His sudden confession made me feel physically sick. Let me go. I tried with all my might to push him away, but he only tightened his grip, holding me firmly in place. Nancy, I'm giving you one last chance. His voice was like a venomous snake's tongue, cold and slimy. Be my woman, otherwise. Not only will I make your parents disappear, but I'll also make you watch as Bennett is slowly tortured to death by me. Dream on. I mustered all my strength, raised my knee, and struck him hard in his vulnerable spot. He grunted in pain and let go of me. I took the opportunity to step back, putting distance between us. You're asking for death. He yelled at the people behind him, clutching his lower body, his face turning a purplish red from pain and anger. Catch her. The men immediately closed in on me. As I stepped back, I took something out of my bag. It was a voice recorder. I pressed the play button. Inside, the entire conversation I had just had with Simon was clearly playing back. I've already sent this recording to all my friends and set up a timed email with all the city's media as recipients, I said calmly. Watching Simon's face change dramatically. If I don't cancel it within an hour, you'll become the city's celebrity tomorrow. Simon's face turned pale, then flushed with anger. He didn't expect that I would pull such a move. Do you think this can threaten me? He said through gritted teeth. I didn't mean to threaten you. I looked at him and suddenly smiled. I was just buying time. As soon as I finished speaking, the factory door was kicked open from the outside. Blinding light instantly flooded in. A group of uniformed police officers filed in one by one, quickly taking control of the entire scene, and behind that group of police officers stood a figure I had been longing for day and night. It's Bennett. He was wearing a hospital gown, his face as pale as a sheet, with fine beads of sweat glistening on his forehead, but he stood straight, like a pine tree that would never be crushed. His gaze swept past everyone and landed on me. In those eyes there was lingering fear, anger, and heartache, but more than anything, there was a tenderness, recovered and overwhelming enough to melt me. Nancy, he reached out his hand to me, his voice hoarse yet resolute. I'm late, come home with me. Simon and his men were quickly taken away by the police. What awaited him was the severe punishment of the law. In the factory, only Bennett and I remained. He quickly walked up to me, pulled me into his arms. And the force of that embrace was so strong it felt as if he wanted to press me into his very bones and blood. You fool! His voice was filled with uncontrollable fear and anger. How dare you come here alone? What if I hadn't made it in time? What would I have done? I could feel his arms trembling slightly as he held me. He was truly terrified. I'm fine. I buried my face in his chest, feeling his familiar heartbeat. And only then did I completely relax. What about you? Was the surgery successful? Yes. He let go of me, took my hand, and showed me a freshly bandaged, extremely small wound on his wrist. Uncle Leo's skills are excellent, he said. The key has been removed. I looked at the wound, then at his pale face, and my heart ached beyond words. He had just undergone an extremely risky surgery, and before the anesthesia had even fully worn off, he came to rescue me. How did you know I was here? Your phone. I had my assistant track its location. He took my hand and led me outside. Let's talk in the car. On the way back in the car, Bennett held my hand tightly the entire time, refusing to let go for even a moment. He told me that after waking up from surgery, the first thing he did was look for me. When he realized I wasn't there and couldn't reach me by phone, he almost went crazy. He immediately had his assistant track my phone's location and also called the police. Nancy. He suddenly turned his head and looked at me with utmost seriousness. Don't do such foolish things again in the future. Promise me. Then you have to promise me. I looked at him, that you won't leave me alone again in the future. He smiled, reached out, and pulled me into his arms. All right, I promise you. When I got home, I found out that my parents were completely fine. Simon had just made a call to scare me. His men were intercepted by the bodyguards arranged by Bennett before they even arrived. Everything turned out to be a close call, but ultimately safe. In the evening, I helped Bennett treat the wound on his wrist. I looked at that small incision and suddenly remembered what he had said during the day. Bennett, do you really not want to be a cat anymore? He froze for a moment, then quickly understood and couldn't help but laugh. He hugged me from behind, rested his chin on my shoulder, and whispered in my ear in that deep, captivating voice, I'm not doing it anymore, because I've already fulfilled that wish. Huh? I turned back to look at him in confusion. He lowered his head and kissed the corner of my lips. See, his breath, warm and tinged with a hint of triumphant laughter, sprayed across my face. Am I not being held in your arms right now? My face instantly flushed bright red. When did this man learn to say such sweet words? Outside the window, the city's myriad lights twinkle. Inside, I have my beloved, lost and found again. Everything is as beautiful as a dream I don't want to wake from. Finally, with my rebirth, I have changed the fate of us all. I saved him. I also saved myself. After Simon was imprisoned, the Downs Group experienced a significant upheaval. However, under Bennett's swift and decisive actions, it quickly stabilized. Our lives have finally returned to the true, everyday routine of daily necessities, under my supervision. Bennett's cooking skills have improved by leaps and bounds, although he still occasionally burns the eggs. He can now prepare a decent table of meals. On weekend afternoons, we snuggle on the sofa and watch an old movie. He rests his head on my lap like a lazy cat, enjoying my caresses. We also go for walks in the countryside when the weather is nice. He holds my hand tightly, as if I were a treasure that might run away at any moment. He turned the once unattainable fantasies in his diary into reality, one by one. He loved so intensely, so passionately, as if compressing 2 lifetimes into this single moment. Yet, deep within my heart, there remains a small, unhealed wound. I know that the Bennett before me is whole and happy, but that Bennett, who in the previous life loved me alone for 10 years and finally died in a cold car accident with endless regrets, has vanished forever. I will forever owe him an "I'm sorry." And I will never be able to make up for the entire lifetime of his that I failed. This day was Bennett's birthday. I secretly bought tickets to the concert of his favorite post-rock band, wanting to surprise him. That band only comes to China once every 5 years. In the previous life, around this time, he went to their concert alone. In his diary, he wrote, "The atmosphere at the venue was great, and everyone was fully immersed. There was a couple sitting next to me, holding hands the entire time. Suddenly, I felt very lonely. If only Nancy could have been by my side. This time, I won't let him be alone anymore." The concert venue was packed with a sea of people. When the familiar melody started playing, Bennett turned his head and looked at me, the surprise and emotion in his eyes almost overflowing. "Nancy, shoo." I made a gesture for him to be quiet. Then, proactively, I held his hand. Intertwining our fingers tightly, he gripped my hand back, holding it tightly. Amid the deafening music and the shifting, mesmerizing lights, we were like the most ordinary, passionately in love couple. When the final song began, the emotions in the entire venue reached their peak. It was a song about redemption and rebirth. I looked at the man beside me, his eyes red with emotion, and suddenly felt an impulse. I leaned close to his ear, mustering all my strength to shout over the surrounding noise, "Bennett, thank you for loving me in our past life." He was stunned. Then, he smiled. He didn't speak, just turned his head and, amidst the cheers of countless people and the fluttering confetti, deeply kissed me. This kiss carried a hint of salty tears and the deep affection of 2 lifetimes. I know that my regrets may never truly be erased, but what does that matter? What matters is now. What matters is that this person in front of me is truly, genuinely by my side. That's enough. After hearing the story above, what are your thoughts? Feel free to share your opinions in the comments section. Looking forward to hearing from you. If you liked this story, don't forget to like it, share it, and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.